Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Manufacturing consent or determining a foreign policy consensus. Who in Washington and the halls of power in Western capitals drive foreign policy decisions, particularly when it comes to Iran, Israel, and Syria? Is public opinion constructed to fit the interests of special groups and lobbies? And is American foreign policy in the country's own interest? To Crosstalk American Foreign Policy, I'm joined by my guests in Washington. Judith Kipper, she is Director of Middle East Programs at the Institute of World Affairs. And we also have Flint Leverett. He is a professor at Penn State and author of the new book, Going to Tehran, Why the U.S. Must Come to Terms with the Islamic Republic of Iran. All right, there's just the two of us and myself. Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I really encourage it. Flint, if I can go to you first, what drives American foreign policy towards Iran? Very simple question. Maybe a complicated answer.
I think that what really drives American foreign policy toward Iran is a post-Cold War determination on the part of the United States to dominate the Middle East, to play a hegemonic role in the Middle East, to micromanage political outcomes in key Middle Eastern states so that those states' strategic orientation is subordinated to U.S. foreign policy preferences, and the Middle East has a regional order which is essentially run by the United States. From that perspective, the problem with the Islamic Republic of Iran is that it won't play along with this kind of hegemonic ambition. It's said it's very open to improved relations with the United States, but that has to take place on the basis of equality and American acceptance of the Islamic Republic. That's not the Washington agenda for the Middle East, and it drives this very hostile posture toward Iran.
Judith, agree or disagree with what we just heard, please?
I partially agree and partially disagree. I think that what drives American policy in Iran remains the fact that the Iranian Revolution was hostile to the United States. We lost a key ally. It was very costly to the United States. And the revolution, like so many revolutions, turned out to be quite brutal. The memory of the American embassy hostages that were taken is still very fresh in our minds. So I think that that's probably one of the really major factors that shapes thinking and policy in the halls of power here in Washington. But right now, the United States has two major problems with Iran, which are quite urgent. Obviously, the Iranian nuclear program, and secondly, Iran's assistance to the brutality in Syria that is being perpetuated by the Syrian regime. In order to get Iran's cooperation, as Flint has said, we need to accept the Islamic Republic of Iran. We need to recognize, though we don't like the regime, that Iran, too, like any sovereign state, has legitimate security concerns. And we need, when we negotiate with the Iranians, be it in the group of six or face-to-face or indirectly or through the Swiss, we need to make it very clear that there's a package on the table, that incremental steps will result in incremental removing of sanctions and limitations on Iran's capacity to be part of the international community.
Okay, so Flint, so Tehran has to be a good boy, and everything will be fine.
I think that is very much the Washington agenda, you know, on both of the... fair enough. But I think on both of the issues that Judith raised, though, if you look at the American position on the nuclear issue could be solved diplomatically in a matter of weeks if the United States would recognize Iran's right to enrich uranium under international safeguards. But that would mean the United States was accepting the Islamic Republic as a legitimate political entity with legitimate national interests. And the United States isn't prepared to do that. Instead, it keeps insisting that Iran has to surrender that right for diplomatic progress to be possible. If you look at the position on Syria, you know, there's been the meeting between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov in Moscow, and people are looking toward the possibility of a conference. But, you know, already the planning for this is getting balled up because the Russians quite reasonably think if you're going to have a conference on Iran, you need all of the relevant and important players there, which means you need Iran there. And the United States is already balking at having Iran take part in a conference on Syria. That is just not diplomatically serious. It's privileging this ambition to hegemony in the Middle East over really serious diplomacy.
Judith, would you like to reply to that?
Well, I think that a good part of that is correct, but this problem of Iran is very, very complicated. It has a huge impact on the entire region. And I think that the Kerry-Lavrov meeting was a good start, but it's not enough. A conference raises expectations and doesn't usually accomplish very much. It may not hurt anything, but I'm not sure it's going to help. In the end, I think that that the U.S.-Russian cooperation and coming to a consensus between the two powers on what needs to be done vis-a-vis
Judith,
Iran.
Should Iran be there?
And Syria.
Well, should Iran be at the table at this conference? Should Iran be there?
Yes, of course. Iran, all the parties should be at the table, but all the parties will posture. All the parties have a set agenda, and so far we haven't seen any willingness on the side of any party to move toward a political solution. So the U.S. and Russia needs to move in very powerful ways to be more persuasive and include the European community, the Arabs, and others, of course, Iran, in moving toward a joint position that is held by both Moscow and Washington, because that will be a very, very powerful way to approach the problem.
Flint, but I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Iran is going to be invited.
You know, I think the U.S. is really digging in its heels on this, which means if you go ahead with the conference, it's going to be a sham. It's going to be a charade. And I think I would differ a bit with Judith in that I think that you know, Russia, Iran, China, the players that are, you know, usually associated in common parlance as in some ways being supportive of the Syrian government. I mean, if you look at their position and even the position of the Syrian government, they have been open to a political process, to having a dialogue with the opposition aimed at some sort of political settlement, which would produce a different kind of political order in Syria. But it's the opposition elements backed by the United States which have insisted, you know, not just on preconditions, but in effect on pre-results from a meeting, where they have to have up front some commitment that Assad is going to step down before this process even gets going. That's not a serious diplomatic position. You know, if you want to stop violence in Syria, you have to get all parties to the table. You can't have these kinds of absurd preconditions. And you have to get down to the business of diplomacy. I think Russia, frankly, China, Iran have been trying harder to do that, trying harder to get that kind of process off the ground than the United States has been, because for the United States to do this means it's acknowledging it can't just dictate outcomes in this part of the world. It actually has to accommodate other parties' interests. It has to accommodate on-the-ground reality.
Judith, jump in. Go ahead, Judith.
Yeah, I have to disagree with what Flint has said, though I have great admiration for his views on Iran. I think that the United States right now for a lot of different reasons that we don't need to get into here, doesn't really have a Middle East policy. So this notion that we want to control things and guide all the internal affairs of all the countries, I think is silly and it's nonsense. We can't do it. We know we can't. On the part of China, Russia, and Iran, they may make pronouncements from time to time, but there is absolutely no evidence that any of those powers are willing to put pressure on the brutality of the Assad regime.
Well, what about the brutality
himself,
of the rebels? What about the brutality of the rebels? Can the U.S. control them? Can the U.S. control them?
No, no. One is a government still, though it's not governing all of its territory. The other is a ragtag, different groups of people. And let us remember, 2 years ago when this started, more than 2 years, the Syrian people went to the street peacefully. It was the government that began to shoot. And that can never be forgotten. The government has killed most of the 70,000 people who have been killed. So the violence
and the Western powers have chosen
Russia, Iran.
And Western powers have chosen a side and giving them arms and training. Correct? These are Islamic groups, correct?
I think that is a really important point. I mean,
Go ahead.
Most of the Arab world has most of the Arab world, most of the world, except for Iran, China, and Russia, have given up on Assad. He is not able to govern his country, and he has to go.
Yeah, because the outside world is tearing it apart.
Not adequate. No, I don't think so. The Syrians are tearing it apart, but the outside world is doing nothing to help
there's a lot of people in the outside world involved. I have to jump in here. I apologize. I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on American foreign policy in the Middle East. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing American foreign policy in the Middle East. Okay, Flint, you got a bit heated in the first half of the program. Where do you want to pick up? Go ahead.
Yes, I think that you know, when you look at the situation in Syria, I mean, it's obvious that many innocent people have been killed, and that is a profound tragedy. But I think that the narrative in the West that this was basically, you know, just a peaceful protest by Syrians that was responded to brutally, and, you know, these people took all of this violence until, you know, a year later, 18 months later, they had to start responding violently. I don't think that's really the way things played out. I think from very early on,
violence was
within
used.
Weeks,
violence was
the first unrest breaking out. Yes, and that I think that outside powers, the Saudis, others, were pouring money and weapons into Syria from a very early point. The agenda was not to bring democracy to Syrians. I don't think the Saudis care about that. Frankly, I don't think the United States cares all that much about that. The agenda was to topple Assad as a way of hurting Iran's regional position. Okay? 70,000 dead Syrians later, this project has not worked. You know, that was the agenda, and it has been a strategic failure. And now countries like the United States face a choice. They can either, you know, accept that this project of toppling Assad to hurt Iran has failed, and they can get serious about a diplomatic process that might produce a political settlement and end violence. Or if they keep doing this, if they keep supporting the opposition, we're going to be looking at literally years of continued violence, and who knows how many more tens of thousands of dead Syrians. That is the choice.
Okay, Judith, that's an interesting scenario. What do you think about what we just heard?
It's interesting, but I'm sorry to say it's really wrong. I mean, I think Flint is really so Iran-centric these days that the fact that the Syrian people took to the streets, as they did in Egypt, Yemen, Tunisia, and elsewhere, in a peaceful way to make change in the country. And at the beginning, they didn't ask for Assad to go. It was only much later, after the government was so brutal. Syria is Syria. We have to think about the country of Syria. 25% are displaced or refugees. The humanitarian problem is really, really catastrophic. It has strategic implications for the region. Iran's help to Syria is a different thing. The U.S. certainly didn't start this, didn't support the rebels in order to get rid of Assad. It all happened by itself. And in the end, outside powers can meddle, but they can't really do very much internally, which is why the U.S.
But what about the 40 to 50% of Syrian society that continues to support Assad?
How do you know that?
I think Assad retains the support of about half of Syrian society. What about them?
Judith, go ahead.
That's what you think. That's what you think, but that's not what we know. We don't know. A lot of people work for the bureaucracy. A lot of people are in the intelligence. The army is totally, practically on the verge of collapse. The brothers, 4th Division, of course, they have to be loyal to the regime because their paycheck, their lives, and the future of their families depend on it. I don't think there's any way now to measure who is really in support of this brutal dictatorial regime, which has really hampered Syria's development and growth. We have no way to know that.
Flint, have we passed a certain point now? Because, you know, it seemed realistic a year ago to have negotiations, but the folks on the ground don't want to negotiate now. Not the people the Saudis are supporting, for example.
Yes, and as long as opposition groups have outside supporters like the Saudis, like the United States, who are, in a sense, egging them on, they have absolutely no incentive to face political reality and enter some kind of negotiating process. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. They don't have an interest in doing that because they're outsiders who will help them keep the violence rolling along indefinitely.
Okay, Judith, well, let's talk about the role of Israel.
I don't know the
Okay, go ahead, Judith. Do you want to reply? That's the point of the program.
Let me just say a word here. I don't know the last time that Flynn sat with Syrians. I happen to be with a group of people who are very active in the opposition, who are in touch with everybody there. And, you know, nobody is risking their life because they're being egged on by the United States or by Saudi Arabia or anybody else. They have nothing. They're being killed, as a very good piece in the New Yorker this week by Dexter Filkins, who just returned. Helicopter gunships are killing them left and right, and they have absolutely no protection.
You know,
so they're not fighting
Judith,
for the United States or Saudi Arabia or anybody else.
Don't you think one of the problems is when you say the opposition, who are the opposition? Who's in the opposition? If you want to mention, let me finish. If you want to mention mainstream media, NPR had this very interesting article about Saudi jihadists going there, okay, being paid, giving tickets, okay. How do you feel about that? Is that the opposition you're talking about?
There are many, many Syrian groups that are fighting, and there are also now, because it's gone on so long, a lot of foreigners mainly from the region, but also from Europe. We have seen that are coming there to work with the opposition. If Russia had not said it would veto a UN resolution 2 years ago, maybe we would have made progress.
Oh, it's all Russia's fault. It's all Russia's fault, isn't it? No, let's remember Libya. Let's remember Libya. Remember Libya.
May I finish?
Go right ahead.
Maybe if the U.S. had taken the steps that were absolutely necessary when the violence started and the regime was using aircraft to have a no-fly zone, it probably would have been over by now. So I think all sides, external powers that have an influence there, have made strategic mistakes which have been deadly for the Syrians.
You know, Flint, I think I've always found it very curious.
Peter,
I've always found it very curious when the Americans say someone has to go, and it's usually a strategic mistake. Go right ahead.
No, I absolutely agree with that. And your reference to Libya is very important. I mean, the Russian and Chinese vetoes at the UN come against the backdrop of both Russia and China having let the Libya resolution go through in March. The Libya resolution, which authorized the use of force to protect civilian populations on humanitarian grounds, but which the United States and others then turned into basically a regime change campaign with NATO aircraft flying missions where they're out to kill Gaddafi. And, you know, from a Russian perspective, from a Chinese perspective, I think from a decent international legal perspective, that is, to say the least, an extremely problematic scenario. And Russia and China were not about to let this scenario repeat itself in Syria. And, you know, as far as, you know, the United States doing, you know, quote unquote, what was necessary early on, I mean, there is this small matter of sovereignty. There is this small matter of international law that says you only get to use force when the Security Council authorizes it, or under a fairly narrow interpretation of self-defense in the UN Charter. The United States has no right. It may have a hegemonic prerogative, or think it does, but it has no right to impose no-fly zones over sovereign states in order to get rid of a leader that it doesn't like.
Okay, Judith, when you want to reply to that?
First of all, a no-fly zone would have had to be an international effort. Secondly, it would not have been intended to get rid of a leader. It would have been intended to protect the Syrian population, 70,000 of whom are now dead. We don't know how many are wounded and maimed, and 25% of the country is displaced or internally or are refugees. So a no-fly zone would have stopped the violence, and I believe there might have been a chance for negotiation. Yes, I know that Russia, and I know all of the Russian policymakers on the Middle East, they are absolutely allergic, obsessed, and worried that the U.S. will again use NATO as an instrument in Syria, and this is, I think, the main reason for Russia's reluctance to work positively to end this conflict, because of the Libyan experience.
Well, Russia has been, I'd like to point out, for 2 years, Russia has worked for a diplomatic solution. For 2 years, the only major country. Flint, go right ahead.
How? What have they done? What's the initiative?
Saying negotiation to go all the way back to Geneva of last year. Best example. Go ahead, Flint.
Yeah. I think that, you know,
a lot of talk, no action.
The fact of the matter is, I would challenge Judith to find one case in which the United States applied military force ostensibly for the protection of civilian populations, in which part of its agenda was not also regime change in that country. I mean, if you look at the Balkans, if you look at Iraq, if you look at what we did in Libya, if we look at what we say we want to do in Syria, in every one of those cases, you know, the argument for humanitarian intervention is inextricably bound up with the argument for coercive regime change. And, you know, frankly, I think Russia and China are eminently justified in saying they're not going to.
Judith, we've run out of time. Judith won't have time to reply. We've run out of time. I'm very sorry. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I love it.